Welcome to the HBOT News Network. I'm Ed DiGirolamo, and today I'm so happy to have as our guest Dr. James Stevens. Dr. Stevens is the medical director at Extivita, a local hyperbaric clinic. Among other things, he has a very expansive practice of his own outside of Extivita, and he's also been the team physician for the Carolina Hurricanes, the hockey team locally where we are here. So welcome, Dr. Stevens.
Thank you very much.
Coming.
Appreciate you having me.
Well, great. And we've talked a little bit about our topic today, and Dr. Stevens has been involved in what Extivita has called the Longevity Challenge, which is a combination of both water fasting and hyperbaric oxygen. And in the kickoff of those, the beginning of the year, each year, that's done over at Extivita, Dr. Stevens generally talks to the group that's doing it. And I remember at one point, maybe we had 30 or 40 that participated in it and started with that, and you went and just talked about what goes on. And I thought that we could start and talk a little bit about fasting and kind of what goes on inside the body while you're water fasting or zero calorie fasting. And so perhaps we could start with that, and you can give us some background. What actually occurs with water fasting?
Well, I think understanding calorie restriction and what happens with calorie restriction, water fasting is the most extreme form of fasting. There's multiple forms of fasting. But if we look at water fasting for an extended period of time, which is what the challenge is all about, we begin to see what the body was really, in an evolutionary sense, prepared to do for many, many years. And that is the cellular trend, or the cellular mechanics, right, are to conserve energy because we've restricted energy. That induces a number of cellular aspects that ultimately will play back into a discussion about longevity. Right? So in calorie restriction, which is basically starvation, right, you now have set the stage for altering genetics, altering cell mechanics to help you when you come out of that fast.
There's a lot of information out there about different kinds of fasts, and I know in the Longevity Challenge, depending on the individual, number of different ones are offered. The intermittent fast is something very popular. A lot of people hear about. What goes on in the intermittent fast?
Well, I'd say there's two forms of intermittent fasting, right? There's the fasting mimicking diet, which people have heard about, FMD, and then there's intermittent fasting, or time-restricted feeding. Placing that up against a water fast or complete calorie restriction, this induces the most change the most rapidly, but it's also the hardest to maintain. People typically aren't going to step out for 10 or 12 or 40 or 30 days of fasting. So intermittent fasting has been developed as a way to help induce those changes, those cellular changes of repair, of lowering inflammation, of genetic stimulation. Fasting mimicking diet took it one step further, which is you're never fully calorie restricted. In intermittent fasting, we typically will say stop eating at 7 o'clock and return at 12 the next day. That would be a typical. Doing that every single day has some controversial aspects as well. Does it really work when you do it every single day? Intermittent fasting can be used in a number of different ways. In a creative sense, where you would do 12 hours, 14 hours, sometimes you may do 24 or 36 hours, never quite the severe restriction of a water fast. And I think fasting mimicking are the principles of how to feed the body a minimal amount of calories, but induce the same cellular changes, right, for repair, for lowering inflammation, improving cardiovascular risk, etc.
What kind of calorie restriction are we talking about? So,
in the fasting mimicking diet,
yes,
it's typically going to be about 700 to 800 calories a day, right? In a female, maybe a little bit less. In a male, probably not more than 800 calories per day.
And how long would you do that for?
5 days. So Walter Longo, out of California, pioneered the longevity diet, wrote the book, helped develop the fasting mimicking diet. And what he found was a certain ratio of protein to fat to carbohydrates in calorie restriction had the benefit of producing some of those cellular adaptations that we're looking for, that we know we're going to get in water fast, in pure calorie, or what we call zero calorie diets. Hyperbarics, as we're going to talk about, right, changes that yet another notch.
It's interesting, and one of the things that I think that anybody that reads the Bible will find that it's brought up many times, fasting. And I think in the book of Daniel, he fasts for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And, it can be somewhat of a spiritual, I would say, adventure, experience.
Well, yeah, I have to agree that fasting really is, in an evolutionary sense, 100,000 years old. Mm-hmm. Because early man simply had periods where there was no calories available. Right? And then they got calories, and then they were restricted again. As you come through history, and we talk about biblical, 5,000, 3,000, 1,000, it became a very typical form, right, of reconnecting, but incredibly also reestablishing adaptation within the cell to better your health.
Mm-hmm. So it's somewhat of a healing, recovering strategy for many different conditions and you mentioned earlier inflammation, so that's a part of it. So it's an anti-inflammatory.
Well, it's really one of the hallmarks, right, of fasting, right, is to induce a cellular state. We call that ketosis, right, which is an anti-inflammatory state, if you will, and then the response to that is cellular repair. It turns on certain genetic aspects. I think that knowing that it's been around since time immemorial, right, and now knowing this, we are a calorie-dense world, right? We have calories 24/7, and we don't need nearly the calories that we consume, and we certainly don't need them in the manner in which we present them to ourselves. At the same time, we have to understand that having access to those calories is not the most beneficial thing in the world. And we need to get back to understanding that a form of calorie restriction, that could be just minimizing your meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I think the water fast is a great reminder. And as you know, many people have near spiritual experiences in that 12 days, right? Mm-hmm. Where hyperbarics comes into play is that it now presents to the cell one of the two key nutrients to create energy. And that is something that to me is very, very exciting, right? When you calorie restrict completely, water only, water fasting, glucose is a requisite in the mitochondria, which is the organelle inside of every cell that creates energy. Life is defined by the ability to create energy. Therefore, life is defined by the creation of ATP, which is the actual molecule of energy. Without glucose, you cannot create energy, right? Without oxygen, you cannot create energy. And so what hyperbarics brings to the table is, as glucose, as calorie is restricted, as we become ketotic, those molecules needed to create energy are driven by oxygen under pressure, right? So it's a nurturing, if you will. It's a sustaining of a very strict state of calorie restriction that's made or improved, I might say, right, by hyperbaric oxygen.
So from the standpoint of prolonged fasts, I think that's, if you're going to do a search, look up prolonged fasts. It's a common term that I've found in my searches, and I just did a 10-day zero-calorie fast, and very strict, with it, and it's my 8th fast, and I have done as many as 21 days. So I understand the feelings that you go through. The first couple days can be more difficult unless you go into like a ketogenic diet, where you're not going to go through that sort of sugar withdrawal, or glucose, glycogen, depletion. As it gets depleted, you can get hungry, right? And so once you get past that, Now you're in fat burn, okay? And so I also find that my state of awareness is greater. I'm more aware of lots of things that I don't normally notice. My wife would move the furniture, and it's a normal day. I don't notice it, okay? To the point where now I'm noticing like everything around me and making better decisions, quicker decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's the God-given survival mechanism that we have. Food gets depleted in the winter time, generally. And that's one of the time frames that we chose for the longevity challenge is January. I find that the summer is much more difficult to fast than the winter, which it's sort of counterintuitive to me, is that you need more energy to stay warm. But in fact, it's the opposite. I have a much easier time of fasting in the winter, just my personal experience with that. And I know that one of the things that you prescribed during the longevity challenge is to take minerals. That I think way back in time, people lived near the rivers that had minerals in them that we don't. We're a very mineral depleted world today that we have to take supplements. And so what is the basis or the need for the minerals when you're doing the prolonged fast?
Well, I think it's important to realize that almost all of us in current times are magnesium deficient. Many of us are potassium deficient. And our diets are deficient, the food sources are deficient in those micronutrients. So part of micronutrients are required inside of every cell, inside the mitochondria, for metabolic processes. So think of creating, using a car factory analogy, right? We're going to create a car. The steel and all the raw materials are in the back of the factory. Inside the factory are all the machines needed to create that car. Out the front of the factory, the car is rolled out or produced. Every cell has a product, right? And every cell requires all the correct machinery. Well, one of the most important fundamentals is that all those machines must be maintained. And so those machines in our world are enzyme pathways and organelles. They have a specific job to create their role in the product of that cell. Magnesium is required for 300 processes in every cell. So if we strictly go to a water fast in the longevity challenge, you're taking somebody who's coming off the street is probably already deficient. I measure this routinely in my clinic, in my patients. And now you're going to restrict them completely. So putting electrolytes or minerals into the water fast makes perfect sense because you're trying to maintain as much cellular integrity as you can while you're in a restricted calorie state.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And so that one of the minerals, it's like a liquid. I think it's like a full spectrum of all different minerals in there. And a little squirt and some water. Yeah. It kind of tastes kind of metally salty, like minerals probably would taste. And if you drink water from a natural stream or a natural spring, I guess is the word I'm looking for, natural springs, it can taste that. You taste that sort of metally, and imagine it's coming from the rocks or wherever underground that's coming from. And so that's important. And one of the things I think that's also important, point out, anybody doing a prolonged fast should, at least have a physical, know that there's no underlying condition that could, create a problem for them. Although, within the longevity challenge, we've never seen that. Some people will get some headaches early on, and I think one of the participants decided to stop drinking coffee while they were doing it. Well, that's going to give you a headache anyway. It's probably not a good idea to decide to quit coffee. You might have to wean yourself off of that at some point, either before or during, but not just go cold turkey, because that tends to get them to think, well, it's the fast that's doing it, and good reason to start eating again.
Right.
I've also found that food and eating food is more of a habit than it is, you're really hungry.
Right. I think we've known that for generations, actually.
Yeah, it's like an emotional behavior.
the ability to have food, right, is in some ways a tremendous privilege. But we leverage that in the wrong direction. We take in too many calories. I think as you get deeper into the longevity challenge, one of the things that happens is what we call ketosis, right? And so people will get what's called the keto flu-like symptoms day 1, day 2, maybe day 3, maybe even as far as day 4. And then it tends to fade away. At the same time, many people, and you alluded to this, will clearly express this change in their mentation, right? Their mental capabilities, and they're calmer, and their thinking becomes easier, if you will. Well, what's intriguing is to know that a glucose molecule, which is the predominant part of our diet, carbohydrates, right, produces a certain amount of ATP or energy. A ketone in the brain in a neuron is 6 times more. So as you get into fat burning, as they call it, as you get into ketosis, you're actually fueling your brain with a molecule that 6 times more energy is produced from than from glucose. And as you transition away in a strict calorie sense, you really get the benefit. And that's where some of the ketogenic diet, attraction has come from. But it's clearly part of a water-restricted or severe fasting state.
So the fat that's being burned is from, at least from what I've read, is generally the visceral fat.
Yeah.
And so is that, and that's also a place where toxins are stored. And is it possible that they've been there for decades in a person in their visceral fat?
Look at some of the studies on PCP, right? We are exposed to toxins we have no idea, right? Mm-hmm. And where are they kept, right? They're kept in cellular tissue, predominantly fat. Mm-hmm. Part of that soreness or achiness or keto flu isn't necessarily the ketone, it's the detoxification that's occurring as well. Matter of fact, when certain people really aggressively do detox, if you've heard of a detox, right, it's a structured stimulus while you're reducing your calories, you can pull too many toxins out of the body and people are miserable. They get fevers, they hurt so bad, they feel like they're in great pain. And that's a heavy release of toxins. I think what we really want to do with hydration within the water fast and oxygen under pressure within the water fast is help the detoxification process, help all these pieces, right? People can come away from this and realize, I can do fine with less calories, right? I just experienced something with 0 calories, right? And I think the hyperbaric oxygen piece helps them through that experience in a way that on your own, it becomes tough. You mentioned summer versus winter, right? The caloric burn in cold, right, 100,000 years ago was high, right? But our cold, as we go outside with very nice clothes on and insulation, it's just a little bit of insulation needed. Summertime is a high calorie burn. Our activity level is much higher. Muscle burns second only to brain. Brain burns 6 times more calories, right, than any other organ or tissue in the body, right? But I think summertime would be harder, to your point, because that calorie consumption, right, or calorie expenditure, excuse me, is, to me, much higher in the summer than it is in the winter.
Just the cooling. So your cooling system.
Your physical activity is higher.
Physical, yeah.
Right. You're out in the heat, right? You're moving around, right? You're doing things that you're much more sedentary in the winter, as a general rule.
Well, one of the things on the prolonged fast is, testing myself is how many chin-ups I can do. That I noticed that I could do the same amount through the whole 21 days. But the second set was not the same. I could hardly do one.
Yeah.
And to me, that maybe that's sort of the survival thing, where you get one shot to get the food.
Sure.
And nobody's going to be chasing a deer for 20 minutes.
Yeah.
If you didn't get it, It's gone.
Right.
So,
Right.
so as far as your ability to expend that, 2-minute burst,
Yeah.
I think you still have that. So surviving is not going to be the issue. It's the recovery and so anyhow, I mean, I think from the standpoint of the way God designed us, it's all rather natural, and it can be explained how, through thousands of years, why it would be mentioned so much in the Bible.
Sure.
About fasting.
Absolutely.
And, it was part of, it's part of a lot of things, I think. One of them is that if you can think clearer and you're trying to learn or focus, or you're getting ready to speak, one of the things that I've learned too is that when I'm in a meeting and it's a large group of people, I can hear more and I can speak more, logically and well thought through during a fast. It's just, maybe that glucose is taking up a lot of energy, not just creating it, but it's using it up. I'm not sure what really happens there, but you're more aware.
Well, I go back to ketones, right? The fact that during the fast, the ketogenic state is a state that your brain does not normally get to see or experience. So imagine giving your brain cells, every single neuron, roughly 6 times more energy, right, per kilocal as you would with a glucose molecule.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that lead to, right? And I think there are some secondary parts. You mentioned some of the spirituality involved, which is the further I get away from having the object of my thought is my next meal. That object of thought is so ingrained in our lives. It's get up, I have to have breakfast. I have to have lunch. I have to have dinner. Well, you begin to realize the have can be removed from that, right? There is breakfast, there is lunch, there is dinner. As you move deeper into the experiencing of fast, I actually don't need food. I want food, but I don't need food. And I think coming across as understanding we don't need the calories that we're consuming.
Mm-hmm.
And I just proved that to myself in a challenge, not so easy, right, but not so hard. I can still do my chin-ups in round 1, but I can't generate the same energy. I can't recover because there's no fuel there, which is why your chin-ups would diminish in round 2. But you didn't expire, right? And coming off of it is, can I now take this experience where my brain became insightful, right? I think that part of the biblical application is, what is the object of my thought, right? In a religious sense, I would argue it shouldn't be about your next meal. I'm going to sit to the side and I'm going to take 3 weeks and my brain is going to do just fine. It's actually going to get more clear. And now I can focus, right, on that object, which is my belief system, right? My God, my creator, why I exist. I think people come out of these fasts with tremendous stories of how it affects them, right? Psychologically, emotionally, and everything. At the same time, what we've done is, in that period of time, we've been able to get to the cellular level and turn certain things on. We'll talk about that more when we talk about longevity in general. The application of living a longevity-focused life day in and day out, which is somewhat different, but applicable to the water, right? The water fast, the longevity challenge.
Well, when you're water fasting and you go into the ketosis and then you're in heavy ketosis, and then there's a phase after that where, as I understand it, in the structural engineers terms, that you have cells that are either damaged or old, basically being recycled.
Yeah.
And new cells are being created. What is that process?
So the cell cycle. Right? The cell cycle is important to understand. I won't get into the whole mechanics of a cell cycle. But in a global sense, every cell in our body has the capability to know, right, where am I, right, in that cycle. And there's a natural cycle for all cells. Well, our current lifestyles, right, our toxic lifestyles, we get into what would be called senescent cells. A senescent cell is a cell that cannot die, but it's secreting toxic cytokines, inflammatory. We think about the wrinkles that we have at 60 versus 25. It's a representative of some of the senescent cells in our skin, right? What happens when we fast, what happens when we change our lifestyle, is we want to go in the other direction from senescence, right? We don't want to continually feed a cell and never let it do its natural decision making. Autophagy, which is what you're alluding to, is the phrase for cleaning house. We all have heard the phrase spring cleaning, right? You go up in the attic and it's like, how did all this garbage get here? Let's get rid of it. That's autophagy. The mitochondria in our cells, which generate energy, can go through the same process. If a cell decides in that process, I am no longer capable of sustaining apoptosis, it literally expires itself and you get a new cell born, right? New cell creation out of apoptosis.
And is it true like that material is, or whatever, the components of it are reused?
Yes, it's all there.
Yeah, it's regenerated. And so,
yeah.
and then you go a little deeper into the prolonged water fast, and there's I guess misfolded proteins, or is that what it is? Misfolded?
Yeah.
Just poorly produced. Something's going on with your DNA at this point that's producing bad stuff, and that gets affected.
Correct.
So
right.
what is that process?
Well, the unfolding of proteins, the application within the genetics of a cell, and the command of what a gene has within that cell is returned, right, to its correct state. Whereas the misfolded state is the effect, think senescence, right? Some people say, and this is a phrase that you'll hear me talk about, immunosenescence means your immune system gets old. And actually, our lifespan is predicted by immunosenescence more than anything else. The ability of our immune system, right, to be young and healthy, reproducible, diminishes in time. So infections, as we get older, become more severe and more common. And so we want to avoid senescence, right? And we can do that with a fast. And we can accelerate the benefits of that with oxygen under pressure.
It's like the 1-2 punch.
It's a beautiful combination.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that was very informative, and I appreciate that. I learned a lot, and I hope anyone listening to this is going to pick up on a lot that you've said here. I just have one final question in this segment, is that if there was one thing, a miracle, that you could ask for right now and you could get, what would that be?
Other than wrapping the earth in a hyperbaric state and putting pure oxygen into our lives.
Well, that would be flammable, so we got to be careful.
Oh, yeah, okay.
But it is wrapped.
Yeah, yeah.
It's been there since the second day. So
right. The pressure gradient that we need, right?
Increase that.
Yeah. All joking aside, right? It would be for people to come to understand, right, the benefit of calorie restriction on a regular basis within their lives. The quality of the food you eat, the amount of food you eat, why you eat, right? The object of your intent, right? Is it just, I got to eat another meal? Why? So I think if I had anything to say, understand that we need far less than we typically consume. That's the starting point.
Okay. Can I say a prayer for that?
Please.
Okay. So, Heavenly Father, please, anyone listening to this discussion with Dr. Stevens, hear his message that calorie restriction is an important part to our longevity, and the quality and quantity of food that we eat can actually impact the quality of our life and extend our life. And I hope that that food will help you walk closer in the way that Jesus Christ taught us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Stevens, and that was a wonderful discussion. I appreciate you coming in, and really look forward to getting you back very soon for another segment.
Thank you for having me.